So friends, welcome to the season of Imbolc, and following on from my story of the old woman in the cave, picking up the thread, beginning to weave again a new story before she goes to the back of the cave to stir the cauldron of seeds over that ancient fire. And with Imbolc, this moment in the wheel of the year, the pagan wheel of the year, the turn of the seasons, this timeless rhythmical swinging through autumn, winter, spring, summer, comes this moment, this beautiful moment where nature is still just pregnant, and we can just see the buds. But I can tell you now, there's a field over here near my house, and I could feel the hope and the joy rising when I heard the first lambs. Now, since the lambs arrived, we've had this massive fall of snow and these sub-zero temperatures, and sometimes it's a really tough time for lambing. But with the season of Imbolc arrives one of our most resplendent, glorious, divine, fiery deities, the goddess Brigid. She is one of the greatest of the Celtic pantheon, and she is known as Brigid of the sacred fire, of the hearth, of alchemy, smithcraft, divination, prophecy, healing, poetic inspiration. She's the goddess of the storyteller, the bard, the poet, the songwriter. But she's also known as Brigid of the sacred well and Brigid of the sacred earth. And she comes before her sister, Ostra, who comes around Easter time to really herald the arrival of spring. Brigid is this beautiful goddess of, she's a solar deity, and she's a goddess of the fire. And I have to say, while mine is roaring a bit too loudly, and I'm just going to turn it down slightly, for most of early February I kept my fire going overnight, and this is a very traditional thing to do. In honor of Brigid and keeping the fire burning. There's something very symbolic, very archetypal about keeping the fire burning. And there was an old tradition around the time of Imbolc and Brigid where women would do what they call this smoor the fire, and they would cover it with the ashes at night and keep it warm so that it would stay alight. And I mean, you would assume this is probably because they would have to bring lambs in from the cold, but also it was part of the sacred ritual dedicated to the goddess Brigid. But of course, she's a real pre-pagan ancient goddess going back 1,000, 20, 30, 40,000 years, who knows. She's really celebrated in Druidic ritual, but you know, it's extraordinary how she represents sacred fire. And we come across this story again and again, the old woman in the cave, the fire, the cauldron. And there is a place in Ireland called Kildare where there is a story that there were 19 priestesses, and their job was to guard the sacred fire, and they would feed it hawthorn, which is one of those very magical trees. One of the trees that opens up gateways to the inner worlds. It was an access to the inner worlds of divination, and they kept it burning for who knows how long. And they say that it was done within a circle, and no man could enter. This was very much women's work. Perhaps in those days men were doing what they did back then, which was protecting the women, protecting the land. There is so much to say about Brigid, but people come together and they light fires and they have a great feast, sacred feast. There is a sense of real reverence and awe and worship. And they weave these little crosses, and they're usually three-pointed crosses. You can find them on the internet. But it's an old, a very ancient solar symbol. So much of this is really wrapped up in the pagan traditions. And we are talking about the times when the Celtic pantheon of gods and goddesses were such a daily part of life and worship on the Emerald Islands of Britain, a place where there was no separation between the world of the living and these many other realities, invisible realities, which were teeming with other beings, spirit beings. And these islands at one time were actually an epicenter of indigenous worship that is legendary in other indigenous cultures to this day. The relationship between nature and the spirit world was profound, and it was powerful. And those ancient pre-pagan peoples, who knows, who can even imagine what it was like in their time to have this relationship where they really understood the language of birds and animals, and that this numinous quality woven through nature it was such a felt and known thing for them. These, of course, were times when the river waters were crystal clear and the forest was thick and full of magic, and they could hunt for 1,000 years with an eagle on the arm and never harm the harvest. There were times where everything was reciprocal, where some people were trained to work with the animals, some were trained to work with the birds, to understand, some were trained to work with deep esoteric knowledge, to work with these other beings, otherworldly beings, from the elementities, the elementals, the entities, the devas, right through to the angelic realms and beyond. There was a midwifing of energy from the inner world to the outer world. And they also believed very profoundly in their ancestral spirits, and that these spirits could come and go at will because there was no separation between the living and the dead. But I digress, because we're really here to talk about Imbolc and Brigid. So what happened to the sacred fires? What happened to Brigid as a pagan goddess? Well, in Kildare, Ireland, there was a shrine to goddess Brigid where a fire was attended by 19 priestesses that it should never go out and would burn eternal. The Broodins, a place of magical cauldron and perpetual fires. There we are again, the fire and the cauldron, disappeared when Christianity took hold. And there we have it. The fire and the cauldron, both symbolic and literal, tended by women, was extinguished by the banishment of pagan culture. It is a long and painful story, and of course whole books have been written about it, but it's really about the persecution and the banishment of the wise women, the women of the hedge, the priestesses, a certain way of life. It was also about the wounding of many, many men and the erasure of the Druid way of life. It was about the genocide of the Druids, the burning of the sacred groves, and so on. And eventually, Brigid was absorbed and appropriated into the Christian church, and she became Saint Brigid. But such is her power, her charisma, her enduring presence, that return of the light that arrives in early February, that signifying of the possibility of new life, new shoots, new hope, is so powerful. And she was so deeply embedded in human consciousness that she remains, albeit now as a Christian saint. But what's really interesting is how she turns up at the birth of Jesus as the midwife. And in the story, she places 3 drops of water on his head. This is actually a very, very much older story, where the Son of Light had 3 drops of water placed on his head. Of course, there's so much in the story of the birth of Jesus that's so symbolic, the 3 wise men and the bringing the gold, frankincense and myrrh and following the star. It's full of mysticism, tales of the mystical journey, the birth of light. So much in it that's symbolic. But anyway, at the end of my street down here, I have a sacred well. Now, Brigid was known as the goddess of the sacred wells, and they said that her waters would heal diseases. It is now known as the Well of St. Hilda, because St. Hilda built the monastery in Whitby, but I suspect that it was long since Brigid's well, because they say it heals diseases of the eyes. And I keep wondering if I'd put some water in my eyes, maybe I won't need glasses anymore. Friends, it's just an ambling talk this month, a bit of a gallop through Imbolc, Brigid, what she means. It's perhaps a bit more coherently written in the blog. But I just wanted to send a story from the fireside. The fire that I did keep burning, very symbolically and intentionally, over these last weeks. And I do seek poetic inspiration. Really, there's so much more to read about Brigid. Really, you could write books about her, but that's my video blog for this month. And next month, I very do much hope to be outdoors somewhere, blogging from the woods. And until then, do take care, everyone. And I really hope we all see each other in person very soon.